Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I can easily say on behalf of all Georgians, thank you for your continued interest in the work of the Georgia Opioid Crisis Abatement Trust and for your commitment to helping end the opioid crisis in our state and to save lives. I'm Kevin Tanner, and I have the privilege of serving as the Commissioner of the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities and the trustee of the Opioid Trust. I want to recognize Governor Brian Kemp, the First Lady Marty Kemp, for their leadership in mental health and their leadership in addressing the opioid crisis. I also want to thank our Attorney General's office and the General Assembly for their continued support in this effort. We are also grateful to all of our regional advisory council members who play such a critical role in ensuring these investments reflect local priorities. I also want to thank the interagency work group that helps grade all the applications, as well as the Georgia Opioid Settlement Advisory Commission appointed by Governor Kemp and local governments for their ongoing guidance and partnership in this work. As you know, Georgia continues to receive funding through the National Opioid Settlement, and we've been moving with urgency to put these dollars to work where they matter most. But the reality is the opioid epidemic is still with us. It remains a community-level crisis that continues to cost Georgians lives and livelihoods, continues to impact families, relationships, and support systems, continues to disrupt our workforce and local economies, place ongoing strain on healthcare, emergency response, and law enforcement. And it continues to have stigma and is still that's still one of the greatest barriers to treatment and sustained recovery that we see in the state. That's why our approach is not just about investing in communities, but it's making sure every dollar that flows through the trust is spent wisely. We're partnering with the University of Georgia, Speaker David Ralston, Institute of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities to ensure that we're able to measure the impact, evaluate outcomes, and that we're able to use data to guide where resources can have the greatest impact. As trustee, my focus is on ensuring these funds are deployed strategically, transparently, because I want to drive real, meaningful, and immeasurable impact. That's why we spent the past 2 years laying a strong foundation and getting communities the money they need to make a difference. In 2024, we worked closely with stakeholders across Georgia to build a transparent and accessible grant process, one that reflects the needs of communities and aligns with the national best practices. This led to an historic milestone. In December 2024, the Trust announced the inaugural rounds of awards totaling $70.3 million. That supported 127 projects all across Georgia, with funding structured across 2 years to ensure both immediate impact but also a sustained progress. In 2025, we built on that momentum. The Trust announced its second round of awards, investing more than $42 million across 110 projects statewide, further expanding the reach of the opioid abatement efforts here in Georgia. Together, these first 2 rounds total more than $112 million and represent a significant investment in Georgia's response to the opioid crisis. Across the state, we're now seeing these projects take root. I was excited to travel throughout the state for signing ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, open houses, and so much more this past year. It was motivating to see the increase in access points, the strengthening of local systems of care, and to truly see the way we are meeting individuals where they are. Today's workshop is about making sure you are equipped to take the next steps toward being thoughtful, impactful, and bringing projects forward that will greatly impact your local community. Before I hand it over to the Trust staff, I'm excited to announce that this year we would be drawing down funds from 2 settlements. In the past, we've only used funding from the manufacturers and distributors. This year, we will draw down additional funding from the Big 5 settlement, which will allow us to invest more into regional projects. We will distribute $10 million from the Manufacturers and Distributors Settlement Trust. 60% of those dollars, or $6 million, will be for statewide projects. 40%, or $4 million, for regional projects. The Big Five settlement is controlled by the trust and the General Assembly. For now, all you need to know is that the trust is able to allocate $10 million from this settlement for regional-only projects. To recap, we anticipate awarding $20 million this year, $6 million statewide projects, $14 million for regional projects. As you complete your applications, please keep in mind that funding for regional projects is our focus for this year. Please pay close attention to how these projects impact your designated region. The trust team is going to go into more detail about all of this with you in a few moments. Now I want to introduce you to that team, who will be invaluable resources to you as you go out throughout this process. And I encourage you, as you work on your grants, to reach out to our trust team anytime you have questions. Holly Lind is our Executive Director of the Trust. Taylor Payton is our Assistant Director of the Trust. Melissa Malcolm is our Opioid Litigation Attorney. And Jeff Holliday is our Opioid Trust Coordinator. They will walk you through the application process and provide insights into how to develop a strong application and a strong proposal. They'll also touch on some improvements to the application portal. Our team has been working hard to reduce incomplete submissions and make the experience more user-friendly. You will have time to take questions at the end, but I do want to encourage you to connect to them directly for follow-up discussion. Thank you again for being here and for the role each of you plays in helping us build healthier communities all across Georgia, not just today, but into the future. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Holly. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Trustee Tanner. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank all of you for being here. My name is Holly Lindy, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Trust. I know most of you here today are on the front lines helping those in your community, and I want to start off by thanking each of you for everything that you are doing. I'm going to go through our slides today and describe the available funding and the grant application process. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. Down just a touch. However, please keep in mind that we will not answer them until the end. So you'll need to be specific in your question. Taylor Payton, our Assistant Director, and Melissa Malcolm, our Opioid Litigation Attorney, will be helping answer some of those questions as we go along in the chat, and we'll choose which questions that we'll answer up here at the end. I do apologize if we are unable to answer your question. You can always email us at the email address that Taylor is going to put in the chat now. This workshop is also being recorded and will be posted on our website along with the slides that I'm going to present today. So the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, is posted on the website already. You can go to gaopioidtrust.org, click on Apply, and scroll to the bottom. Much of what I'm going to cover today can be found in the NOFO, as well as our new application checklist, which is also at the bottom of the Apply page. So our agenda this afternoon looks like this. I'm going to go through an overview of the opioid settlements so far and the allowable uses of funds. Then I'll turn it over to Melissa to provide an overview of the trust and the governing entities. After that, we'll move into what everyone is really here for today, the funding amounts that the trust is releasing this year for state and regional projects, which of course Trustee did just review, how to apply, and what's new in the application portal. So let's talk about where the funds in the trust come from. Many of you have probably heard about the Manufacturers and Distributors Settlement. Georgia is estimated to receive about $638 million of the $26 billion national settlement. But let's talk about how the Georgia settlement breaks down. Of that $638 million, 25%, or about $159, goes straight from the national administrator to the participating local governments. These are the cities, counties, and other government entities who independently sued the manufacturers and distributors. They receive their money and make decisions independently of the trust, and there are about 250 of them. The remaining 75% is deposited into the trust. Of that 75%, which amounts to about $479 million, The manufacturers, Johnson & Johnson, will pay Georgia about $91 million through 2031, while the distributors will pay about $388 million through 2038. The trust entered into a memorandum of understanding, or MOU, that sets the parameters of how the settlement funds are to be distributed and can be spent, which I'll talk about in a few slides. So this is a graphical representation of that funding distribution. You can see the pie chart on the far left, that first 25% that goes straight from the national administrator to the participating local governments, and the remaining 75% that's sent to the trust. In the middle pie chart, you can see the breakdown of that 75% that is sent to the trust. The MOU states that at least 40% of the funds must be spent on a regional basis, and the remaining 60% can be spent on state projects. The 40% of funds from the manufacturers and distributors settlement is distributed across 11 regions, 5 of which are the qualifying block grantees. These are defined in the MOU as counties or cities with a population of at least 400,000. So that's Cobb, DeKalb, Fulton, and Gwinnett counties, and of course the city of Atlanta. The regions, including the QBGs, receive their funding directly from the trust via a formula defined in the MOU, which takes into account the number of fatal overdoses in that region and the number of treatment and non-addiction treatment pills shipped to that region. The QBGs receive their funding via the formula from the trust, but make their funding decisions independent of the trust. And you can see here there's a slightly different graphical representation of how that funding breaks down. So since the manufacturers and distributors settlement, Georgia has settled 2 other lawsuits. The first, which trustee mentioned, is what we call the Big Five. That's Teva Pharmaceuticals, Allergan, which is now AbbVie, Walmart, CVS, and Walgreens. That settlement is a little over $500 million coming to Georgia. And depending on the company, these funds will be paid out through 2037. The second is a settlement with Kroger, which is about $55 million, which will be paid out through 2034. Now, just like the manufacturers and distributors settlement, the first 25% is sent by the national administrator to the participating local governments, and the remaining 75% is sent to the state. But there's an important distinction about where that 75% is sent. Similar to the manufacturers and distributors settlement, of that 75%, 40% is to be spent on regional projects, and that is the portion that is sent to the trust. The remaining 60% is sent to the state treasury to be spent at the direction of the General Assembly for approved purposes by appropriation. It's a mouthful. So similar to the slide where I showed the graphical representation of the manufacturers and distributors settlement, this shows the funding distribution of the Big Five and Kroger settlements. It's the same distribution. You can see in the pie chart on the far left, the 25% that goes straight from the national administrator to the participating local governments, and the remaining 75% that's sent to the state. In the middle pie chart, you can see the breakdown of that 75% that is sent to the state. The MOU states that 60% of the funds is to be sent to the state treasury, and 40% must be spent on a regional basis, which is distributed by the trust. And the regional funding breakdown is the same as for the manufacturers and distributors settlement. And again, here's that similar breakdown, second graphical breakdown as the manufacturers and distributors settlement. So each of the 3 MOUs refers to something called Exhibit E, which is an attachment to each settlement agreement that lists the core strategies and approved uses for which the settlement funds may and must be spent. You can see this list here, and it includes medication-assisted treatment, Narcan or naloxone distribution, treatment for pregnant postpartum women and babies, people who are incarcerated and returning citizens, harm reduction techniques, data collection analysis, and many others. These guidelines are meant to prevent the states and participating local governments from using the funds for things that have nothing to do with opioid abatement, like what happened to the states, like what happened when the states got money from lawsuits against the tobacco companies in the 1990s. A copy of Exhibit E is available on the website, and there is a link to the document in the NOFO. I'm now going to turn it over to Melissa Malcolm, our opioid litigation attorney, to talk about the structure of the trust.
Thank you, Holly. I wanted to start by level setting just a little bit on the differences between DBHDD and the trust. So the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities is a different legal entity from the trust. The Trust is a nonprofit trust, a nonprofit organization established by the formulation of a trust, is required by the settlement agreements and approved by the courts as they approve the settlements. This means that if you are awarded a grant from the trust, that you will enter a contract with the trust itself. This is not a contract with DBHTD. That means that as a grant recipient and contractor, you will need to adhere to the payment policies and procedures of the trust. You'll have a different reporting system, a different reporting portal, and seminal events and things that are going on with your contract will come through the trust website, gaopioidtrust.org, not through the DBHDD systems. The trust is administratively attached to DBHTD. That is why you see that we have email addresses that include the DBHTD provisioning. But all grant awards are from the trust and not DBHTD. That means that when you send in your expenses for reimbursement, we expect you to keep up with what you spend through the trust. And if you happen to also be a DBHDD contractor or provider, you would keep those funds separate. We need to be able to confirm that the expenses spent for the trust actually went towards the trust projects. The trust contracts will be on a reimbursement basis. This means that you must expend the funds and then submit proof of payment to the trust in order to receive reimbursement. There are some limited exceptions. For example, prevention and media campaigns can be prepaid. Vehicles that are pre-approved, the actual expense and vehicle that you're going to purchase will be pre-approved by the programmatic officer. That expense can be paid upfront, as well as construction cost. And finally, as a reminder, these funds are not taxpayer dollars. Just as Holly described, these funds are subject to the specific legal requirements of these settlements. That is why we must be so diligent in confirming how funds are spent before they are reimbursed. I want to go over the structure of all of the entities that influence the decision made before grants are administered and released and awarded by the trust. The manufacturers and distributors MOU, as well as the MOU for the Big Five settlements, set forth 4 levels of influence that go into each trust grant decision. We have the trustee, the Georgia Opioid Settlement Advisory Commission, known as the GOCAT, the Regional Advisory Councils, or the RACs, and the qualifying block grantees. The MOU requires and set forth the government participation mechanism, which makes funding recommendations to the trustee on how to allocate funds. The trustee has the ultimate authority in deciding how to spend funds for approved uses. Each member of the government participation mechanism must have a background in opioid use disorder, addiction treatment or public health policy, mental health treatment or policy, or opioid-related law enforcement experience. To satisfy this requirement for the government participation mechanism, the GOCAT was created and established by executive order of Governor Brian Kemp, who named it the GOCAT. The GOCAT is made up of 8 voting members and 1 non-voting chair. The governor's executive council, Sam Hatcher, is the chair of the GOCAT and the 1 non-voting member. Then 4 members are appointed by Governor Kemp as representatives of the state. 1 member is selected by the Georgia Association of Community Service Boards as required by the MOU. And then the other 3 local members are selected through a process that was originally created by the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia and the Georgia Municipal Association. And you can see here the current makeup of the GOCAT. In addition, before the GOCAT makes its recommendations to the trustee, The regional advisory councils review the regional applications and make recommendations to the GOCAT. The regional advisory councils, which we call RACs, are established with between 3 and 7 members. 3 members are absolutely required by the Memorandum of Understanding. These are a member of a county board of health, a member of the executive board of a community service board member, and a sheriff or the sheriff's designee. To round out the additional 4 members of a RAC, the trust recommended 4 additional categories of experience to serve. The university system, someone with experience providing treatment for opioid use disorder, a person with lived experience, and a member of the judiciary, in particular, the accountability court system. These local members of the RACs are established and appointed through a similar process as the GOCAT from the local governing bodies within each region. Now, notice here that regions 1 through 6 mirror the DBHTD regions. These were established, that geography was established in order to make use of the administrative efficiencies of the current service delivery system within DBHTD. Then you will see that the QBG counties and City of Atlanta are carved out of Region 1 and Region 3 in the Metro Atlanta area. Again, they receive their funding directly from the trust in a lump sum and make their spending decisions independently of the trust. All funds spent by the trust must be spent in accord with that Exhibit E that Holly went over just before I stepped up here. Again, and then the counties also have to have a regional advisory council that has those 3 mandatory members serving on that. The County Board of Health, a member of the Community Service Board, Executive Board, and the sheriff or the sheriff's designee. Then, after we decide how much funding the trust is going to release, so in this instance, $20 million, $10 million each from the 2 pots of money coming from those main settlements, then that is broken down into these particular allocations by region. The formula to distribute the funds, again, takes into account the number of fatal overdoses in that region, along with the number of treatment and non-addiction opioid pills that are shipped to the region. This must be updated every 3 years. So this is the last year that we will have these particular percentages. These will be redone before the next round of funding. You can see here that Region 1 receives the highest percentage of funding, which takes into account the level of harm that occurred locally throughout the entire region. Region 3 appears that it receives the smallest, so technically it receives the smallest percentage, but recall that all of the QBG funding is subtracted from that total in Region 3 and goes directly to the qualifying block grantees. Now I will turn it back over to Holly to talk about the funding the trust will distribute and how to apply.
Thank you, Melissa. Let's see. All right, what everybody's here for. So let's move on to how much the trust is making available in grant awards in 2026. The trust is releasing $10 million from the manufacturers and distributors settlement. 60% of that, or $6 million, is available for state projects, and 40% is, or $4 million, is available for regional projects. For the first time, we're releasing funds from the Big Five settlement. That entire $10 million allocation is available for regional projects. So you can see in this table how much is available for state projects as well as regional projects. Each region will receive its allocation from the manufacturers and distributors and Big Five settlements, along with any unspent funds from 2025. A proposal is eligible for regional funding if the proposed project falls entirely within the geographical boundaries of that region. A proposal is eligible for state funding if the project covers at least 2 regions or QBGs. The trust does not accept proposals that fall within the jurisdiction of any single QBG. Any request for funding from a QBG should be directed to that QBG, and these definitions are also in the NOFO if you missed me saying them. So when you start an application, you will need to select the county where your organization is located, which will populate the region automatically, and then you will select state or regional funding. If you select state funding and your project is only eligible for regional funding, we will route your application to the appropriate region. So please make sure you know which pot of funding your project is eligible for. There's no predefined maximum funding amount that can be requested for each application. However, we encourage you to request funding amounts that are justifiable and reasonable based on the scale and expected outcomes of your project. So this slide provides a few guidelines for you to think about as you begin your application. The first is that grant funds may not be used to supplant current funding. You may only use funds for a new project, an expansion of an existing project that is not grant funded, or continuation of an existing grant funded project. And because of the parameters under which the trust operates, again, Exhibit E, which I talked about a little bit ago, funds may not be used to generally treat a population suffering from substance use disorder. The proposal must be targeted to the portion of the population suffering from opioid use disorder specifically. But that can be fairly broadly defined in that OUD does not have to be the primary diagnosis, but rather one of several diagnoses. So now let's talk about the application sections. To create an application, you must create a profile in the portal, which you can actually do now before the portal begins to open to accept applications. One thing I want to stress here is that the organization's authorized representative should be the one creating the profile, and the contact for the organization should be that authorized representative and their associated email address. The name of the applicant organization must match the name of the organization on the financial documents, as well as the name on the organization incorporation documents. And I'll talk about those in a few minutes. The applicant organization must be the organization that will enter a contract to be paid by the trust if the proposal is successful. The trust will not accept applications submitted by one organization on behalf of another organization unless the two organizations have an agreement that one will act as the fiscal agent of the other. In that case, a letter on the letterhead of the fiscal agent acknowledging the agreement to serve as the fiscal agent of the applicant is required to be submitted in the financial documents portion of the application. If you are awarded a grant, you will be required to sign a letter of award, and that letter of award goes to that initial profile email address. So please make sure it is correct and up to date. That is also the name and email address that we will send the contract to, so it's really important to keep that information up to date. If the primary contact leaves your organization, please update the information. I've now said that 3 times, please keep it up to date. After you create your organization profile, you'll need to select your county of organization. Again, that's the county where your organization is located. If your organization is not located in Georgia, please select out of state. You will also need to select your requested funding type, which is the bucket of funding, state or regional, that you are requesting, which I talked about last slide. Then you'll move on to the application information, where you will need to provide an application name and the counties that your project will serve. Remember, if you selected regional funding on the prior page, you should only select counties in a single region. If you selected state funding, you need to select counties across 2 or more regions. Then it's on to the core strategy tab, where you will select your project category and subcategory. These are listed, of course, in the portal as you select them, but they're also listed in an attachment A to the NOFO. Next is project approach. Here you'll need to provide an executive summary, your proposed approach, your demonstrated need, collaboration, a project timeline, and your work plan and deliverables. In these questions, you should provide a detailed description of the project you're proposing, what services you'll deliver, what population you'll serve, why there is the need for the project in your community, what partners you'll engage with, and any other information you think is relevant that clearly explains how your proposed project will address the opioid crisis in Georgia. We also ask if you plan to subcontract, which includes providing subawards. If you plan to, select yes and provide the names of the subcontractors. If you don't know those yet, please provide a description of what you will be subcontracting for. You also must tell us how long your project will last. Projects can be any length up to 2 years. The start date should be January 1st, 2027, as that is when contracts will begin. You can select an end date up to December 31st, 2028, which is 2 years. There are some additional questions at the end that ask if your project needs construction or a qualified engineer. If you'd be asking for any kind of construction or renovation, you'll need to answer yes to at least one of these questions and upload documentation that justifies the amount that you're requesting, preferably an estimate from a licensed Georgia contractor. You can also tell us if you'll be submitting letters of support. If you select yes, you can upload those documents in the Supporting Documents tab. The next section is your organization background and qualifications. We need you to tell us about your organization, why you're qualified to carry out the proposed project. You'll also need to tell us if any part of your proposed project requires some kind of licensure, certification, or accreditation. If your application includes implementation of any clinical services or medications for opioid use disorder, or MOUD, or the application includes reference to treatment in conjunction with other services, the applicant must answer yes to this question and submit supporting documents. If these clinical and/or MOUD services will be provided through a subcontractor, this must be explicitly stated in the application. The next section is the potential impact. We want you to describe how success will be achieved and measured, including specific goals and associated objectives. These should tie back to your work plan and deliverables. And then there's the project budget. Everyone must submit an appropriate and realistic budget along with a narrative justifying each budget line item. You must enter a description for each budget item that explains the estimated costs. Budgets should be as specific as possible, and narratives should explain how the costs associated with each item or category relate to the implementation of the project as outlined in your proposal. If your budget totals $500,000 or more over the life of the project, you must fill out the financial calculator and risk assessment. This is your total budget, not $500,000 per year. And also, if you're asking for general indirect costs, those are limited to 10%, but that doesn't necessarily mean we will award that full 10%. After the budget is a series of statements or questions that we ask you to disclose, where we ask you to disclose if you're a current DBHD provider, if you've applied for other funds to support this project, if you've applied for opioid settlement funds before, if you're on the excluded provider or suspended or debarred suppliers list, or if you have any conflicts of interest with any of the parties to the lawsuit. Then you provide your supplemental documents. You're required to provide audited financials or profit and loss statement. If you're a new organization for less than 18 months at the time of the application, a business plan is an acceptable alternative. You must also submit a list of key organization personnel, including staff descriptions and an org chart. And finally, your organization incorporation documents, either from Georgia or the state where your organization was incorporated. Some of the additional documents that may be required, depending on what you're applying for, are construction or qualified engineer documents, organizational licenses, certifications, and/or accreditation documents, and letters of support. And finally, there's an attestation you must sign before submitting the application. This basically states that you, as the authorized representative, have personal knowledge of the application and the authority to submit it. You will comply with all applicable laws and grant requirements should you receive an award, and that everything submitted in the application is true and accurate. And this is that person who is, again, this is the person who is your organization's authorized representative. Excuse me. So we've got some new features in the 2026 application portal. We've been working with our IT contractor for the last several months to update the portal. So all items marked with an asterisk, which is almost every question, are now absolutely required. You must fill out either the entire question or put some characters sort of generally in a response box and save the tab before the next tab will unlock. I mentioned before the county of organization, where your organization is located, and the county served, where you will be conducting your proposed project. Those are new. There's a character limit on many questions this year as well. The executive summary is limited to 1,500 characters, which is about 250 words. And then the larger questions, proposed approach, demonstrated need, collaboration, and organizational background are limited to 6,000 characters, which is about 1,000 words or 2.5 pages. And of course, that executive summary is also brand new. And probably everybody's favorite change for those of you who have applied in the past is that there are now 2 years for the budget. When you enter your budget line item and amount, you will need to tell us if that line item is for year 1 or for year 2. Another new question is about your plans to subcontract. Again, if you know the names of the subcontractors, that's great. If not, tell us about what you plan to subcontract for. We've also added the big 5 companies to the conflict of interest questions in the disclosures tab. And as a safety feature, we have added an idle time logout. So if you're working on your application and you step away to do something else, make sure you save your work because you will be automatically logged out after 30 minutes. But keep in mind that every time you move to a new tab, the work on the prior tab is saved. If the portal automatically logs you out, you might only lose your unsaved work on the tab you're on. And I hope that makes sense. Another new feature is an exemption from some requirements for state agencies and city and county governments only. State agencies are exempt from the financial calculator, the audited financials, and the organization and corporation documents requirements. However, state agencies will still need to enter 0 in each field of the financial calculator and upload a blank document to the audited financials and organization and corporation document sections of the application. City and county governments are only exempt from the organization and corporation documents section. Again, they must upload a blank document to that section. Now that I've gone through the application sections, let's talk a little bit about the application process. So once you submit your application, it's reviewed to make sure all the required pieces are complete and that your request qualifies for either regional or state funding. Once those checks are complete, it is assigned to the appropriate region for review and grading or to the interagency work group or IWG if it's an application for state funding. Once the IWG and RACs have graded all their assigned applications, they forward their recommendations to the trust staff. What we as trust staff do is then review everyone's recommendations to ensure that there aren't any math or other errors, basically just sort of a quality assurance check. We then bundle all those recommendations and put together a package for the GOCAT so that they can review and vote on the applications. The GOCAT recommendations are then forwarded to the trustee who makes his final decisions, which are then announced. You as the applicant then receive an email generated from your profile about whether or not you have been awarded. If you have been awarded, that letter will tell you how much your award is, and if your award is less than you applied for, you can go into the portal to see what changed in your budget. This is why it's really important, like I talked about earlier, that the person who's authorized to sign the letter of award is the primary contact on the organization profile and that the information is current. So this is a graphical representation of the application process. We'll start at the bottom when an organization submits an application for funding. It's either routed to the appropriate RAC if the funding is for a project that falls within that geographical region, or to the IWG if the funding is for a project that falls across at least 2 regions or is statewide. The IWG are subject matter experts at DBHGD, the Department of Public Health, the Department of Community Supervision, and others. They review and grade applications within their specialty, and once the RACs and IWG members complete their grading and the trust staff has completed the QA checks, we forward those recommendations to the GOCAT. And once the GOCAT votes on their recommendations, those are sent over to the trustee, who maintains final decision-making authority over all funding decisions by the GOCAT and the RACs, but not the QBGs. The other important item on here is the reporting and compliance piece. The MOUs define annual reporting requirements that the trust and each government entity must meet. So this is the scoring rubric that both the IWG and RACs use to score each application. Each application is scored by at least 3 graders, and the scores are averaged for a final grade. An application can receive a maximum possible score of 130 points. And you can see more information on the scoring rubric on the apply page on our website. You can see the full scoring rubric, which includes a description of the amounts that each grading point, the points that you can get for each grade. So now I want to give you some tips based on some of the things that we saw in the 2024 and 2025 grant applications. Make sure your application focuses on the portion of the population that suffers from opioid use disorder and not just substance use disorder. Make sure you're detailed in your budget line item requests. We want to know how you got to the amount you're requesting. For example, if you're requesting funding for the staff, we want to know their position, their salary and benefits, and the percentage of time you anticipate they will dedicate to the project. If you're asking for scholarships to treat people at your facility, tell us how many people you anticipate treating and the amount each scholarship is worth. If you're asking for any kinds of supplies, tell us how much these supplies will cost and how much of each you'll need. Make sure you ask for what you need. We, of course, understand that things can change between when you applied for funding and when you receive a grant award, and we can accommodate some minor changes. However, we won't add a whole new person to your budget, and we won't move all of your funding from year 2 into year 1. If you submit more than one application and one is rejected, we will not include an item from a rejected application in the accepted application. Make sure your numbers match your words. This is mostly related to budget line item requests, but also goes for other sections in your application. Make sure that what you put in the budget line item description for how you got to your budget request matches that budget line item narrative. This also applies to making sure your words match your other words across sections. Be concise. While we've instituted a character or word limit this year, more words are not necessarily better. And when you create your application title, please don't make it the applicant's name. The title is part of your contract. Make sure you include construction or renovation documents if you're requesting construction or renovation costs. Make sure if you don't have additional documentation like an estimate from a licensed contractor, then we don't know if what you're requesting is a reasonable amount and cannot approve that funding request. That also goes for license certification and accreditation documents. If you're proposing a project that requires any of these pieces of information, we can't score your application if those documents are not included. And please, please, please check over your work before you sign that attestation and hit that submit button. I wanted to provide some examples of things I talked about just a moment ago. These are examples of an insufficient budget narrative contrasted with a detailed budget narrative that we're looking for. So under the insufficient budget narrative, you can see that while they gave information on the amount of the FTE to be paid for by the grant, there's no information on the salaries. There's generally no detail on how the applicant got to the budget amounts they're requesting. How many drug screens and how much do they cost? What are the associated lab fees? What are associated lab fees? How much are they? What MAT training is the applicant asking for? How much does it cost? On the right, you can see how the applicant broke down each cost into its components and demonstrated how they arrived at the requested budget amount. On the left, we cannot understand how they arrived at the requested budget request. Now, we know that there are some costs that you won't be able to fully estimate, but please do your best to provide enough information, as much information as you can. And I mentioned making sure your numbers and your words match. Not only did the application on the upper left leave off a project end date, you can see that the start date on the upper left, you can see that the start date on 2 of their deliverables is prior to the start date of their project. And then one deliverable end date is prior to the project start date, and the other is on the project start date. On the upper right example, you can see that the project start and end dates suggest that the project will only last 1 year. However, their budget description suggests that their project is to last 2 years. And another important place to match your words and numbers is in your budget line item narrative. You can see 2 examples below that includes a good amount of detail to help us understand how they arrived at the requested budget amount, but you can see that the line item narrative does not match the amount requested. Apologies. Okay, sorry. Hit the wrong button. These are some of the reasons we might deem an application incomplete. You might not have submitted the appropriate financial documents or organization and corporation documents. You can find a list of the types of documents that are acceptable in the application checklist on the apply page of our website. The name of the applicant might not match the name on the financial documentation and organization and corporation documents, and there's no fiscal agent letter. You might not submit both an org chart and a list of key personnel and their qualifications. Again, of course, we recognize that these folks might change between your application submission and award, but submit one that is accurate at the time of your application. Did you submit the required license, certification, or accreditation documents? Again, a list of the types of documents is in the application checklist. And finally, did you fill out the financial calculator accurately if you're requesting $500,000 or more? So there are quite a few additional resources available on our website. The NOFO, as I mentioned, is already up, and we created an application checklist this year, which provides more information on our expectations for each section and the documents we require. And we've also updated the resource toolkit. You can check out the continuum of care documents for each region and the state. We also have Exhibit E on the website, which provides guidance on the types of projects we can fund. And there is, of course, the scoring rubric that shows what our graders look for when they're grading each application. As a reminder, the NOFO is on the website, so you have 2 weeks to prepare your responses before the portal opens on Friday, April 24th. The portal will remain open for 30 days and will close on Saturday, May 23rd at 7:59 p.m. So for all intents and purposes, you have 6 weeks to submit your application. I walked through all the questions with you, and these are listed in the NOFO as well as the application checklist, so please submit your application early. Proposals that do not include all the required information will not be considered. Proposals not submitted by the close of the application window will not be considered, and no additional information or documentation received after the close of the application window will be considered. So this is an application timeline. I apologize. I've got my slides slightly mixed up. We've got, so here's the timeline for our for the NOFO release. So again, NOFO was released yesterday. The portal will open on Friday, April 24th at 8 a.m. and will close May 23rd at 7:59 p.m. We anticipate making award announcements in October of 2026, that's this year, and then executed contracts will begin on January 1st, 2027. And you can see that we've got a couple of upcoming in-person workshops. Thursday, April 16th, will be at Southwestern State University in Americus. That's this coming Thursday. Friday, April 24th, we will be at the Cumming campus of University of North Georgia. And Tuesday, April 28th, we will be at Georgia Southern University in Statesboro. Again, these are listed in the press release that is included on the crawler of the website on the front page. And also you can find these slides on the website early next week. And finally, the best way to contact us is our email address, gaopioidtrust@dbhtd.ga.gov. But there's one thing I want to stress when thinking about contacting us. We are happy to answer specific questions about whether a document meets the minimum standard of an application requirement or to clarify any confusion regarding the NOFO or these slides. However, we will not answer any questions related to the quality of an application response, give opinions regarding an application, or review an entire application or portions of an application. So please think about your question before you send it to us. And now we're ready for some questions that Melissa and Taylor have been reviewing. Is there anything that I can answer?
Taylor has done an amazing job answering virtually every question.
So has
in
Melissa.
the chat.
Well, that's why she is the amazing assistant director and the amazing litigation attorney that we have.
One thing, we had some questions asking if people were qualified to apply. So just go over, all the entities that are able to apply.
Yes, almost any entity is able to apply. You must select if you are a nonprofit, a for-profit organization, a government entity, or any kind of other. So virtually any kind of organization can apply. The only type of entity, if you will, that cannot apply is an individual or group of individuals. You must be incorporated in some way, shape, or form. Any others?
This video will be posted on our website.
Yes, this video will be posted on our website early next week, along with the these slides. So yes, you will be able to review them.
And yes, a nonprofit could subcontract with a for-profit that would want the for-profit to apply.
Yes, and list under the subcontracting question, you would list the nonprofit as the subcontractor. Again, we would be paying the for-profit. Melissa and Taylor are studying the questions. That's why there's a brief silence. But I'm sure there's probably additional questions coming in fast and furiously as people are typing now that we are done.
Okay, so we do have a question regarding current contractors whose contracts end March 14th, 2027.
Mhm.
And then they would be applying, starting their projects January 1st
Yes.
of 2027.
Yes.
So there is going to be some overlap.
Some overlap, yes,
So-
yes. And we will address those issues coming up, but generally you will expend the funds in your current contract through the end of your current contract and begin expending funds, which theoretically are maybe slightly different for the new contract on January 1, but we can have further discussions if you are awarded a contract.
Can you talk a little bit more about QBGs, what that means?
Yeah. So the QBGs are designated in the MOUs as those counties with 400,000, with a population of 400,000 or more, cities and counties. They qualify both as qualifying block grantees, so they receive their portion of their funding from the trust according to that regional funding distribution I talked about. They also qualify as participating local governments. So they receive both funding streams and make their funding decisions completely independent of the trust. So if an organization is located in a QBG county, you may apply, so Fulton, Cobb, DeKalb, Gwinnett, City of Atlanta, you may apply for funding from the trust. However, you may not implement only within that QBG county. So for example, if you are an organization that is located in Cobb County and want to do your project entirely within Cobb County, we as the trust cannot fund that project. You must talk to Cobb County and find out their application process, how they're distributing those funds. And I hope that answered that question. And Taylor and Melissa are continuing to review the questions in the chat.
We'll give it another moment, but it looks like everything has been answered.
I certainly tried to give as much information as I could in those slides. So I'll go back to that contact us page for folks. Can always email us. We are constantly monitoring that email inbox, and we recognize that people will have questions once you get into the portal. But we have tried to make things more user-friendly this year, provide more information, and we're hoping that we are providing all the information that folks need.
Can you talk a little bit more about the allocation this year and how it's being divided?
I'll go back to that slide really quick. Yep, so the manufacturers and distributors, all the funding comes to the trust. So the $10 million that we are distributing from the manufacturers and distributors settlement is divided 60% is available for state projects. That's $6 million. $4 million of that 10 million is available for regional projects. And again, the amounts are divided by the percentages that were determined by the funding formula. Again, the only portion of the Big Five settlement that comes to the trust is the regional portion. Therefore, the $10 million that we are distributing from the Big Five settlement this year is available for all the regions, is only available for the regions. There is no state funding that is distributed by the General Assembly by appropriation. And then we have some rollover funding left over from 2025. So all that is added together. And you can see on that far right column, the 2026 total allocation, that is all the funding available for each region, as well as the state. I think that probably covered it.
Can an applicant address more than one core strategy in the same application? For example, prevention and harm reduction.
So the preference is to divide them out. However, we do recognize sometimes that they naturally just cover more than one core strategy. So again, if you can divide them out, that is our preference, but we recognize that sometimes they can't be divided out. I actually want to go back to, I meant to add on to the response to the prior question about the funding allocation. This table is available in the NOFO, so you can see it there. Again, Taylor and Melissa are monitoring the chat.
Can we talk a little bit about past grantees applying for funds again this year? If they are a continuation, if they're doing a new project, would we want them to verify this and kind of what the terms are of existing awardees applying for new funds?
Yeah, so probably the biggest thing would be to note in that disclosures piece of the application that you have received funds from the trust or potentially from one of the QBGs or local participating government funds. But you would note that in your application. The other place that you can note it is, for example, in the proposed approach or in the executive summary, noting that you are requesting funds to continue an existing grant funded project. Now, each project is graded independent of each other and independent of existing funding. But you should note that so that the graders understand that you are requesting a continuation of existing grant project.
How do you know if you need state funding or regional funding?
So, as I talked about, if your project falls within the geographical boundaries of that region, so here's the regions, that qualifies only for regional funding. So if you're implementing in a single county other than a QBG, you would apply for regional funds. If you are applying for funding across 2, 3, 4 counties that only fall within that region, you are only eligible for regional funding. If the project that you are applying for covers counties that cross at least 2 regions, and that does include QBGs, you may apply for state funds. So you could apply for, so long as, let's say, I'm looking at the map, a county in Region 6 and a county in Region 2, you are eligible for state funds. And we also do have a list of the counties in each region on the NOFO. So not just the map, but also a list of the counties themselves, alphabetically, of course. So you can double check the counties that you're interested in implementing in and see if they fall across at least 2 counties.
So if someone wants to implement in Fulton County and the city of Atlanta, but at that site serves individuals who originate from across the state of Georgia, would that be eligible? To state it more specifically, as it goes on, must they provide services outside of the QBG, Fulton County, city of Atlanta, in order to apply for these funds?
So generally, so as I had talked about before, if your project falls across at least 2 regions, which includes the QBG, your project is eligible for state funding. And we also recognize that there are projects that have a significant draw from across the state. And generally, we will allow those projects, those applicants to apply for state funding if you can show that your draw is from throughout the state or multiple regions.
Can you talk a little bit about how the application needs to be opioid specific, but intervening upon also co-occurring disorders and how that would look in an application?
Yeah, so oops, where was that slide? I honestly can't remember. Oh, fundamentals, there we go. So the target populations are those with a primary diagnosis of OUD, of course, but also OUD can be part of a co-occurring disorder, can be part of a diagnosis of polysubstance use, can be comorbid polysubstance use of OUD, as well as a co-occurring mental health disorder. So really what we're looking for is that subpopulation of the population suffering from substance use disorder that has opioid use disorder somewhere in their diagnosis. And that is very important because we cannot fund it. Otherwise, that is against the terms of the court settlement.
Can an applicant include building expenses that they have expended prior to the application?
No, we will not fund we will not fund costs that have been expended prior to the start of the contract. Period. End of story.
Can you talk a little bit more about construction documentation and what is required there?
So really, we're looking for some kind of estimate. We would like it to come from a licensed contractor that talks about the estimate that how you got to the amount that you're requesting. If you're just asking for $500,000 for construction, how do we know that what you are requesting is an appropriate amount, either high or low, or that just generally we don't know anything about what you would be using the funds for? So having an estimate, A, shows us both what that your estimate is reasonable, but also B, so we know, if you will, what we're funding. So yeah, we need some kind of documentation that shows what we're funding and that it's reasonable.
Can you talk more about what you're looking for payroll cost? Could someone just say $600 times 52 weeks in a year?
Yes, we will accept that kind of information. However, if you are awarded a grant, you will need to show that you have paid that person that amount, and we need to see proof of payment. And Melissa may have something to add to that.
Well, we'd want to know the amount of effort, the percent of an FTE.
Sorry, yes.
And the job title, the role.
Yes, and that person must be included in the org chart and the all the documentation that we require in the key personnel section. But generally, that is appropriate. But is that $600? Is that 100% of an FTE? Is that 50% of an FTE? Is that 75% of an FTE? That kind of stuff. Still working on reviewing the chat. I think sometimes questions beget questions.
Okay. Talk a little bit about how they would need to address opioid use disorder if they're also addressing suicide, behavioral health challenges, alcohol use disorder, and other substance uses. If they're all listed in the application, then what do they do?
I'm not completely sure I understand. Like, do you understand? I mean, I think it's, you know, if you're looking at your population, what percentage of that population suffers from opioid use disorder? As we talked about, is what portion has opioid use of those individuals? Which portion has opioid use disorder? Is it 50%? Is it 20%? Is it 70%? What percentage of the population has some diagnosis of opioid use disorder? Again, polysubstance use, comorbid polysubstance use, co-occurring mental health disorder, everything. What's that percentage?
Someone is a grant writer or subcontractor for an app or a organization. How should they enter the point of contact for the application itself?
So for the application itself, the primary point of contact should not be the grant writer. As I have stressed, the primary email address of that profile will receive the grant award, the letter of award, as well as the contract. So if you are the grant writer, I hope that you are working with the authorized representative of your organization to provide them the information and have them enter the information, or enter the information, change the information at the end, because we're not going to go, if you receive an award, we're not going to go chasing down the authorized representative to have them change the email address. So please do not make the primary contact the grant writer.
Can you speak a little bit about documentation that's required for startup organizations and just kind of the documentation you'd like to see overall for salaries, staff, including the program director and executive director?
So for startups we define as being in existence for 18 months or less at the time of application. We require a business plan. Again, the application checklist actually talks a lot about this. We require a business plan because at this point you likely don't have any audited financials or profit and loss statement. We'd also require the information that you submit in, you also, organization and corporation documents. So you should be incorporated at this point. The other thing is, if you are requesting $500,000 or more, you will still need to fill out the financial calculator as well as the risk assessment, but the likelihood that you will have any information other than any amount other than zero to enter into the financial calculator is high. So you would just need to enter zero. In terms of, again, you still need to submit documentation, an org chart, key personnel, and their qualifications. Again, you may only have a couple of folks, but you still need to submit that. And then for in the budget line items, you will need to submit information about salaries and FTE, level of effort. I think that was it. So everything any established organization would have to submit, but just the main difference being a business plan rather than audited financials and profit and loss statement.
Could you talk a bit more about how specific they need to be in breaking down office supplies? Do you need each ream of copy paper?
No, of course you don't need, of course, every ream of copy paper, but, go on Staples. Say, you're going to need 5, what do you call ream? I guess we still call them. I don't know. At, $4.99 each. So tell us, that you've made an effort to research these costs, and that you're not just putting in a number because that's the number you think it would be. Make an effort to show us that you did the research.
And then can you also go over a little bit when someone would need to submit construction documentation? Would this be required for things like facility upgrades? When do you want to see that type of document?
So yeah, facility upgrade, absolutely, because that is a renovation. So construction also includes renovation. So if you are interested in renovating a building, then yes, you need to include some kind of estimate. But keep in mind that if you are requesting construction or renovation costs. We can only fund, the likelihood that we can fund 100% of that cost is low because the likelihood that you are treating people other than those with opioid use disorder is high. So maybe think about just the portion that you are requesting that would focus on that opioid use disorder population.
Are funds targeted to a specific core use? For example, are there funds set aside for prevention or
Any of the other approved uses.
anything else?
No, we do not have a specific amount set aside for each approved use or strategy. However, the likelihood that that is going to happen next year is high. So keep that in mind. But no, there is no specific amount that we have set aside for each approved use or core strategy.
All right. And I'll add, so since prevention activities do occur before diagnosis.
Yes.
We recognize.
Yes.
That prevent more than just OUD.
Yes, and you can see there at the bottom of the slide that I currently have up, we do recognize that one of the target populations is individuals at risk of opioid use disorder for prevention activities, yes.
I think
We're good. All right. Well, everyone, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go back to that contact us page in case you didn't get this. But again, this information will be posted on our website. Our email address is on our website. Please ask specific questions about minimum standards. We won't answer any questions about the quality of an application or anything related to any portion of your application other than very specific questions. Thank you all for being here today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.